Hey everybody, how's it going? This is Max with BuzzTox here, and I am back with a Game of Thrones Season 8, Episode 1 breakdown and explained video. In these videos, I go through this episode scene by scene, and I break down everything to make sure that we understand all the symbolism, all the hints, and all the potential character and story arcs before Episode 2 drops. But first thing I want to start off with is the opening credits scene. I'm very happy because it's a lot different than everything else we've seen before it. Usually the opening scene focuses on the Game of Thrones, all the different houses, how they're all fighting and clamoring to sit on the throne of the Seven Kingdoms. But this time it's more about a song of ice and fire. It's about the duality and the myth of the Long Night and the savior that's coming to defeat him. We see the gold bangle, but this time instead of all the houses, it's filled with the dragons from the Red God, and the ravens representing the old gods, the two religions representing ice and fire. And this credit scene really follows the Night King's journey south. And we see first off, he goes to the last hearth. And we know how that goes by the end of this episode, and then we see it continue to Winterfell, and I think we'll see the Night King land in Winterfell in episode 3. Or we may be surprised and see that he actually arrives at Winterfell by the end of episode 2. But in Winterfell we see the Great Hall and we see the Crypts of Winterfell, really displaying that these places have a very key role in the upcoming season. And we've seen that so far based on episode 1. But then we also see some interesting symbolism that can be interpreted in many different ways. We see a lion, and we see something that resembles the Night King holding a wolf head. But then we see this creature mangled and beaten, hung on a tower in between those two figures. And I think this symbolism represents the history of the fight for the Dawn, what everything represents. We see the lion, that I don't think only represents Lannisters, I think it represents the lion that Azor Ahai tempered his sword in. And then after that, tempering it in his wife Nissa Nissa to create Lightbringer. And then we see this creature hung in the middle, and from my interpretation, it looks like it almost has scales. And it looks like the head was cut off, and maybe it's being held by that Night King figure. This reminds me of an interpretation from the books that I touch on in my Azor Ahai video, where Bran sees the vision of a winged wolf. But the winged wolf, Bran might find out that it wasn't him, it was actually Jon Snow. The wings of a dragon, the head of a wolf. Jon was raised as a Stark. He thinks like Ned. Externally, he is everything that embodies a Stark, but internally he is the blood of a Targaryen. Maybe the Night King is holding the wolf because Jon has to shed the Stark identity and become the Targaryen. And like I said in my previous videos, I believe a sacrifice must be made to please the Night King. That's why he's leaving all these symbols. To remind everyone of the previous long night, and to remind them that there is a prince that was promised to him, that has not been delivered. But then we go to King's Landing and go through the front gate, and then we see the Scorpion Ballista shooting the dragon head, like in Season 7. I think we'll go back down here again, and I think we'll see that Cersei is mass-producing Scorpion Ballistas to help her defeat Daenerys. But then we also see amazing imagery on Azor Ahai. We see 3 dragons, the dragons that were birthed from Daenerys, but we also see a comet, and I believe that this is the Bleeding Star. We've seen it before, just before Daenerys was born with her dragons, but I think there's other interpretations of the Bleeding Star. The prince that was promised was born amongst salt and smoke, with the Bleeding Star. In Season 1, we see Daenerys reborn with the Bleeding Star. But in Jon's case, we see Jon born with a bleeding star put over his bedside. And that prophecy of the prince that was promised is very different from the story of Azor Ahai. Him tempering his sword in the lion and Nissa Nissa, creating Lightbringer and defeating the Night King. Check out this video where I talk about the differences between Azor Ahai and the prince that was promised, and what that relationship means to defeating the Night King. But then from there we go to the actual show. And I'm not going to be going scene by scene in chronological order, I'm going to focus in on location. And much like the credits, we start at the last hearth. And here we see Tormund, Beric Dondarrion, and the wildlings arrive. And we see that it's completely decimated, everyone is dead, and the Night King has run through the last hearth. And I kind of figured that this area was disposable and the Night King was going to use it to amass much more of an army. And he did, and this just paints a picture at how unstoppable the Night King is. And I'm sure we'll get an even bigger illustration of that when he comes to Winterfell. But then we see Dolorous Edd run into Tormund and Beric, and we get this moment.
Stay back, he's got blue eyes!
I've always had blue eyes!
And it's really good seeing these characters together because Dolorous Edd and Tormund have a history. They helped bring Jon Snow back to life. And it's nice seeing these two characters from vastly different sides who hated each other to now being close friends. But Beric asked Dolorous if he found anyone, and they direct him to Ned Umber. And we know that Ned came back to the last hearth to get all of his people, with all the carriages and horses that Sansa promised him, and bring them back to Winterfell to their safety. But unfortunately, they didn't make it. But interestingly enough, we see Ned hung up on the wall with a spiral symbol behind him. And Beric says that it was a message from the Night King. And he's right. We've seen in previous seasons that the Night King always uses imagery and symbols to communicate. And that to me speaks volumes, because he's not coming south for just death. He's coming for a reason, and he's trying to communicate that. And as they're speaking, Ned Umber starts screaming. And Beric has to kill him with his flaming sword. But then I believe this spiral symbol starts to take a different form. The symbol completely turns on fire. And much like how this symbol originates from the Children of the Forest, I believe that the Targaryen sigil could also originate from this symbol. And Ned Umber in the middle of this spiral is not by accident. We always see sacrificed figures in the middle of this symbol, or in the middle of this kind of imagery. The Night King was created next to a weirwood tree surrounded by that spiral symbol. Craster's children have been taken to the lands of always winter, and the child is put on a podium surrounded by ice spikes that resemble the rocks that make these spiral symbols in the first place. We also see it illustrated here, where the Night King puts a child in the center of the spiral. And what's interesting is we also see Jon Snow in the center of the spiral. And we see countless imagery of Jon and Daenerys both in the middle of a spiral or a circular figure, like they are a target. And that goes deep into my video when I discuss how to defeat the Night King, where to understand what the Night King wants, you have to look at the past. And I think the truth is the Night King wasn't defeated by Azor Ahai, who pulled a flaming sword. Azor Ahai actually tempered his wife and pulled out a flaming child. A Targaryen child, a child of fire, and that's what the Night King desires. That's why the Targaryen sigil ends up mimicking this spiral, because every 1,000 years or so, a Targaryen needs to be sacrificed to create the peace. That's why it's called a Song of Ice and Fire. But it's not the prince that was promised that defeats the Night King. It's the prince that was promised to the Night King. And the Night King has come south all this way to reclaim his prince, because it is promised to him. That's why we see the symbols. That's why we see the Night King sending signs that he's coming south. And that's why in this scene we see a child, Ned Umber, in the center of the spiral. I think that this is going to be the crux of the story, but what shape it takes, I'm not sure. As a fan of Jon Snow, I like to think that Jon is the bridge between ice and fire. He's Targaryen and he is Stark. He's a character that's brought peace to both sides in every given situation. And I think his next task is going to bring peace between the White Walkers and the people. And this happened thousands and thousands of years ago and has been forgotten and reinterpreted in the religion and stories that we know today. Or you never know, the show could forget all that, and much like in Season 7 when Beric was telling Jon that all they have to do is kill the Night King. And maybe the heroes will get together and they'll band together and they'll kill the Night King and every single white will drop. But I'm putting my bet on this, because I don't believe that the Children of the Forest, the First Men, and one person carrying a flaming sword could defeat the Night King and his army. They're too strong and they're too powerful. And there's too much information that suggests that the Night King wants something, and is coming south for a reason. But after that, let's go to King's Landing, that the Night King and the dead have broken the wall and are coming south. And her only response is good. It just shows the state that she's in. She's backed into such a corner and doesn't really have anything anymore. And all she really has is vengeance, getting revenge on the people that have wronged her. And we know in Season 7 she told Jaime that she just wants to sit in King's Landing and wait and deal with whatever is left of who defeated the White Walkers. And if they don't beat the White Walkers, then so be it. Cersei believes she couldn't help out anyways. But after that, we see Harry Strickland and Euron Greyjoy arrive in King's Landing. And they're in the throne room addressing Queen Cersei. We learn that they have 20,000 men, 2,000 horses, but no elephants because they are not fit for that voyage. And this scene is interesting, because Harry Strickland says that some men didn't make it.
Yes, Your Grace. A few died in transit. They cheated at dice.
And this part's interesting because Harry Strickland said that some men didn't make it during transit. And he's insinuating heavily that it was Euron while he looks at him in disgust. And I think this speaks volumes to Harry Strickland and the partnership between him and Cersei Lannister. Harry's not happy that Euron Greyjoy was killing his men for sport. And I believe it's laying down the groundwork of Harry Strickland leaving the loyalties of Cersei and breaking his contract to join another ruler. So we could be witnessing a pivotal point in Golden Company history. Because these men don't only break contracts, they're known to being one of the most honorable groups as sellswords go. And over time, I believe Harry will see her as not honorable. That not only is she waiting for dead to come and fight her enemies, she also represents dead because her people, such as Euron, are killing his men. And I think the Golden Company will switch in one of two ways. The Golden Company could switch allegiances to Jon and Daenerys, and together they'll bound together to fight the Night King and the White Walkers and defeat Cersei. But I think politically the Golden Company could play a pivotal role as well. Jon now knows that he's a Targaryen, and I don't know how long that secret is going to stay hidden. If that secret gets in the wrong hands, like Varys, he could conspire with Sansa to put Jon on the throne. And I'll get more into that later based on information we see in this episode. But what that means is that Sansa and Varys could work together to give Jon support, as well as give Jon an army. But I think a good way to earn the Golden Company to break their contract is first of all proving to them that you're an honorable person. But second of all, this company is based on exiled Targaryens. What better way to earn their trust than give them lands to settle on in Westeros, and pardon them for their actions many, many years ago? And this is why I think they would follow Jon, because Jon has already proven himself to bring wildlings south of the Wall, even though they were hated, and gave them lands to settle on to make peace. And I think the same could be done with the Golden Company. But then outside of that, we see that Euron clearly wants to sleep with Cersei. He tells Yara this, and he makes it very clear to Cersei. And after all of that, after Cersei constantly pushing him away, she turns and lets Euron into her room. And then after the act is done, they have a scene together discussing how he compares to Robert and Jaime, and he promises her that he's going to leave a prince in her belly, and we see Cersei getting a bit emotional. And I think that's because this to me is less about Cersei trying to fill a physical or emotional need, but rather her strategically doing what's necessary to keep Euron as an ally. I think Cersei's smarter than she lets on, and she realizes that Euron is not necessarily a secure ally. And in order to keep Euron loyal to her, she unfortunately had to do that to keep his loyalty. And I think she's getting emotional because that reminds her of Jaime and the child that they could have together. But then we finally see Bronn. I was wondering what they were going to do with his character, but we see it in this scene. Qyburn arrives and says that Queen Cersei has a job for him. And Bronn assumes that Cersei wants him to kill someone that her soldiers cannot. And he assumes that it's Daenerys. And Qyburn specifically says that Cersei has other plans for Daenerys. And based on history, Cersei runs on hate. And I can guarantee you she has something very poetic and tragic for Daenerys planned. And Cersei hates Daenerys for multiple reasons. First of all, she made Tyrion her hand. And she hates absolutely everything about Tyrion. And someone who puts their faith in Tyrion is someone that Cersei wouldn't respect. On top of that, Cersei's been constantly reliving the prophecy. She knows that there's going to be a more beautiful queen that is going to take her place. And Cersei is threatened. And we know based on the last 7 seasons that Cersei runs on being threatened. She felt threatened by Marjorie. She felt threatened by Sansa. But now she feels threatened by Daenerys. And we know that Cersei does elaborate plans of revenge for people she hates. Look at what she did to the Sand Snakes. Ellaria Sand murdered her daughter by kissing her with poison. Cersei did the exact same thing, so Ellaria could slowly watch as her daughter died, and while her body decayed. And maybe a guess that I have is poetic justice that Cersei would want for Daenerys is for the beautiful and beloved Daenerys to be seen like her father, the Mad King, the ruthless one. And I think that would be her plan for Daenerys, to destroy everything that she stood for, and make her seen as another mad Targaryen. Cersei knows by now that Daenerys doesn't want to march to the Red Keep and take it. She doesn't want to put civilian life at stake. She doesn't want to be seen like her father. The reason why she knows that is because it hasn't happened yet, and because Daenerys tried to make peace with Cersei to defeat the White Walkers. I think Cersei will use that to her advantage and try and encourage and engage Daenerys to make her do something rash, to show her true colors. Or not necessarily her true colors, but the past of her ancestors' actions. And in that act of desperation, Cersei also has wildfire in the storages of King's Landing. Cersei could burn them all, just like Daenerys' father wanted. And I think that's because survival is not really the number one thing on Cersei's mind. Tyrion thought it was, and that's why he trusted her. But it's clearly not. Cersei knows that the Valonqar is coming. She knows that a prettier queen is going to replace her. And I think more than anything, she wants to go after her enemies. But after all that, Qyburn tells Bronn that she wants him to kill Jaime and Tyrion, as he gives him a crossbow. And that's the poetic justice. That's how Tyrion killed Tywin. So we see Bronn grab the crossbow in confusion, and I think we're going to see him go through his character arc in his final journey in this season. And that question really is, how much of a sellsword is he? And what defines Bronn? We've seen Bronn grow a lot as a character. We've seen him become really great friends with Jaime and Tyrion. And in terms of symbolism, in the last season, we saw Bronn choose to fight versus his money. So I think we'll see Bronn overcome this, and that kind of feeds back into the last season when Tyrion said that whatever Cersei pays, he will pay double. But I think all in all, we don't have to worry about Bronn doing anything to Jaime or Tyrion. But then we go to the Greyjoys and we see Euron talking to Yara. And this happened a lot faster than I thought. But basically Yara says that Euron is on the losing side. And he says that if he is, then he'll just leave. And that really shows the loyalty of Euron Greyjoy, and I think that explains Cersei's actions by letting him into her bed. But after we see Theon really quickly rescue Yara, and we hear that Yara's plan is to secure the Iron Islands because Euron isn't there anymore. And it will be good strategically because they could go to an island that is protected from the White Walkers. But then that also begs the question, what about Dragonstone? And I think we will see Dragonstone again because I think it's close enough to King's Landing for an attack. Or it's a safe place to retreat from the Night King. So in terms of what the Iron Islands means for the future of this season, I'm not sure. But I think the key difference in this scene is showing that Yara is a true Greyjoy. And we saw Theon go through his journey last season when Jon told him that he's both a Stark and a Greyjoy. And much like how this time Theon saved his sister Yara, he now needs to go north. And he needs to save and help his brothers and sisters, because he is both a Greyjoy and a Stark. And that's an interesting dynamic between the two Greyjoys, because Yara supports Daenerys, but if Theon had the choice, he would support Jon. And that could be another implication that we would face later in the season. But then finally we get to Winterfell. And this scene where Jon and Daenerys finally arrive is very well done. It harkens back all the way to season 1, and it shares the same imagery. We see this boy running and climbing a tree, much like Bran climbing the castle, really representing a new generation and how we've seen our characters grow up and see what they've become. The boy who climbed the tree may someday become the king. But in this scene also it's shot very similarly, plus the music is the same as season 1. We see Arya get excited, but she stays quiet. I think Arya as a character is very strong, but she doesn't want to be seen in a vulnerable position. So she'd rather see Jon on her own. She'd rather see Gendry on her own. She'd rather see the Hound on her own. And she always puts up fronts to protect how she's feeling emotionally. We also see Tyrion and Varys in the carriage. And we see a great banter between the two characters, really just cementing their friendship. They have been through a lot. And Varys believes a lot in Tyrion, and we've seen that from earlier in the seasons. And it will be interesting to see where their friendship goes later this season. But all in all, in this scene, we really get a grasp on how Winterfell isn't really accepting Daenerys and her followers. And when they hear the dragons, that only cements that fact. But when they arrive, we see Jon reunite with Bran, which is very nice, but he immediately realizes that Bran is weird as hell, so he moves on and says hi to Sansa. And it's very clear that Sansa's very upset and disagrees with bringing Daenerys north, and she disagrees with giving the north to Daenerys. We see Sansa tell Daenerys that Winterfell is hers, much like what her father said to Robert Baratheon. However, the circumstances here are very different. But then Bran snaps and lets Daenerys know that her dragon has fallen and has been resurrected, and the dead are marching south. And I think this really puts into context the situation, and now our characters need to adapt to this eventuality of the Night King coming to Winterfell. And that's where we end up in the Great Hall and we see what Sansa has done. She had all the great houses retreat to Winterfell as a home base, where everyone can be fed and everyone can be safe. Because as you remember in Season 7, Sansa wanted a lot of food being transported to Winterfell, because she knew that there was a possibility or eventuality that all of these houses would have to retreat to Winterfell to be safe. But I think the feeling of this scene shows how much has changed in Winterfell since Jon left. Take Lord Umber. He needs more wagons and horses to go get his people from the last hearth. And he addresses Sansa first, and he addresses Jon as Lord and Daenerys as Queen. I think this shows that first of all, Jon has lost his title as King of the North because he gave it to Daenerys. But secondly, it shows that they see Sansa as just as much of a leader as Jon at this point, because the North doesn't really approve of the actions that he's done. And Sansa has done very little to defend Jon and his actions. And that's one of the reasons why Arya was so upset with her last season. So Sansa sends Lord Umber away. We find out what happens to him later. And Jon says that they need to send a raven to the Night's Watch to have them come south. No point in defending a broken wall. So that leads to next episode where we're going to see Dolorous Edd, Beric Dondarrion, and Tormund arrive at Winterfell and share the news that the Night King is near and they must prepare for battle. But we see further as Lyanna stands up and speaks that Jon is losing his grip on the North. She says she doesn't know what he is anymore, a king, a lord, or nothing. And Jon states his claim that he chose the North over a crown, and he will always choose the North. And here it makes it sound like he bent the knee to get Daenerys as an ally, but Sansa is sitting there knowing that that is not the case, and she talks to Jon about that later. But then Tyrion stands and defends Jon, but while he's defending Jon, he announces that Queen Cersei is also marching north to help fight the White Walkers. And here we can see everyone upset, including Sansa. Sansa may be a bit naive, or seems like she's not seeing the White Walkers of as big of a threat as other characters. She's at least not closing her eyes and being blind to everything else around her, and she's the only one who's truly playing a political game. She knows Cersei isn't coming north, whereas Tyrion has dismissed it and believes Cersei because of the circumstances at hand. But over and over again we see Sansa continuously putting the North against Jon, because she combats everything he says and she undermines all of his political choices. When she comments on how Winterfell is going to feed the greatest army that is ever seen, that's a backhand to Jon, because she didn't ask for this, she didn't prepare for it, and it puts Winterfell in her court. So while she loves Jon and wants the best for him, she's also taking support away from him. But then we go to some scenes in Winterfell and we see Gendry handling dragonglass. He's obviously a great blacksmith, so he'll be creating weapons for all of our characters. But more importantly, he's taking more of a leadership role, which is interesting because he's a Baratheon bastard. Maybe it could lead to him taking his place in the Stormlands. Who knows? But during this, we see Tyrion approach Sansa, and the last time these characters saw each other was at Joffrey's wedding. And they talk about their past, but mainly they talk about the current situation of Cersei marching north. Sansa questions Tyrion's trust in Cersei, and she believes that you should never trust Cersei under any circumstance, whereas Tyrion thinks that Cersei has something to live for, and that's her child. And this speaks volumes to Sansa, because much like how she really disrespects Daenerys, she now feels differently about Tyrion. She told him that she once thought he was one of the cleverest men alive. And Sansa seems to be the only one who knows that Cersei is not coming north, and that will be validated next episode when Jaime has his trial. But that politically really harms Daenerys and Jon. Why should Sansa put her faith in Tyrion's judgment or Daenerys as queen if they put their faith in Cersei to come north? It shows a lack of proper judgment. And over time, the North, I believe, is going to continuously be upset with Jon, because he is backing Daenerys wholeheartedly. But after this scene, Tyrion and Bran have a moment staring at each other. And in this episode, Bran really likes staring at people. But the most important thing is that Bran likes staring at Lannisters. He stares at two characters in this episode, Tyrion and Jaime. And I believe Bran is staring at them because they do have an underlying purpose. Tyrion has a pivotal role in the Long Night, and we've seen Red Priestesses take a liking to Tyrion, or a fascination with him. This speaks volumes about Tyrion's character, that he is going to have an impact. And I think Tyrion's the kind of character to help build a better world after the White Walker threat is dealt with, and he's expressed these concerns to Daenerys. He wants to ensure that the world Daenerys wants to build remains the same. When the wheel's broken, how do you ensure that it stays broken?
How do we ensure your vision endures? After you break the wheel, how do we make sure it stays broken?
You want to know who sits on the Iron Throne after I'm dead? Is that it?
But then we see a great reunion between Arya and Jon, and this has been a long time coming. But what I like about this scene is that it's very reminiscent to their send-off in Season 1. They had a heartfelt goodbye centered around her new sword that Jon made for her. Whereas this scene, they came together and they reminisced and looked at their swords, which speaks to their journey, where they've gone, what they've claimed, and what they've attained when Jon shows her Longclaw. But then they have a discussion about Sansa. Jon feels like Sansa's smarter than everyone. And I'm sure, like last season, he feels like she's undermining him in front of the North. But Arya surprisingly defends Sansa, saying that Sansa's the smartest person she's ever met. And Jon points out that Arya is defending Sansa, but Arya says something very important. She's not defending Sansa, she's defending their family. And she tells Jon that Sansa is defending their family as well. And Jon tells Arya that he is their family. And Arya tells Jon to never forget that. And I think this scene is crucial. Because first of all, it gives an in on Sansa's character. Sansa doesn't want to undermine Jon and take the North from underneath him. She loves Jon, she wants the best for Jon, but she strongly disagrees with his judgment at this point. Jon is strictly concerned about fighting the White Walkers, whereas Sansa, sure, she's worried about it, but she is not letting go of the politics. Because at the end of the White Walkers, there's going to be a world left, and she wants to make sure that they play their cards right. So if the White Walkers are defeated, they are in a good place. And I think Arya reminding Jon to never forget that he's a part of their family is most definitely a foreshadow of him finding out he is Targaryen later in this episode. And that's going to be something that Jon is going to struggle with. But I believe what they'll come to is that even though Jon is Targaryen, he's still a Stark. He's still their sibling. And Sansa, Arya, Bran, they'll all still want the best for Jon. And I'll touch on it more later, but if Sansa finds out that Jon is a legitimate Targaryen with a claim to the throne, she would more than definitely pick Jon and support Jon. Because she's always agreed and supported Jon in the past, she just sometimes disagrees with his decision making. And since Jon isn't worrying about the political ramifications of his actions, he's just worrying about the North, so it's good that he has characters to round him out. Sansa talks to him about these things, so he at least can realize it. And we have Davos in Jon's corner fighting for Jon, and he's bringing things to the table that Jon wouldn't himself. So it's nice to see that Davos is taking care of Jon. And we see that in this scene when Davos is talking to Varys and Tyrion. Davos tells them that not so long ago the Starks and the Karstarks were killing each other on the battlefield, but Jon brought their houses together, and this is when they see Aelys Karstark arrive. Davos tells them that the Wildlings and the Northerners are stubborn, and in order to get their loyalty, they need to earn it. But the problem is I think it'll be very hard for Daenerys to get loyalty with the North, and especially Westeros, because in Essos, Daenerys earned loyalty every single time by using fire and blood. That's how she earned the Dothraki. She burned the Dosh Khaleen. That's how she claimed the Unsullied. She burned the Masters. And this is a unique situation because they hate Targaryens in the first place. Not only does the North hate them, the Vale hates them. And all of Westeros hates them. And she reinforced that when she burned the Tarlys. If Daenerys had a single opportunity to earn loyalty, it would be defending Winterfell. But it could be possible that she's caught up in the Game of Thrones before that even happens. Because the issue is Daenerys is focused on being queen. So she expects people to support her. But the problem is that she needs to command respect in order to get support. And the one person she managed to do that with is Jon. And that feeds into how Jon rules. Jon doesn't care if you like him or hate him. And every single title Jon has claimed, he's been elected, like a democracy. He didn't have to fight for anything. People flock to support his cause. And that's what Melisandre says about Azor Ahai.
Stannis does not need to beg this lord or that lord for support. The Lord of Light stands behind him.
And how many ships has the Lord of Light got in his fleet?
He has no need for ships.
I'm sure he doesn't. But we do if we're going to war.
And this is what Sam has been talking about. His brother and father didn't kneel, so Daenerys killed them. But the Wildlings never kneeled either, but Jon spared them and let them settle their lands in Westeros. What will happen next episode when Jaime arrives and he will not kneel to Queen Daenerys? We'll see next episode. And this proposal from Davos was smart, but I don't think Tyrion and Varys really see it as an eventuality, because Daenerys doesn't want to share her power with Jon. And Davos proposed Daenerys and Jon ruling as king and queen of all of the Seven Kingdoms. This option may come back up if Jon's heritage becomes true, if they find out that he's a true Targaryen, but other people may have different agendas and may have different plans for Jon Snow. And Tyrion and Varys write it off by saying that Jon and Daenerys don't want to listen to the counsel of old men, and they respect the wisdom of age to keep them far enough away so they don't have to listen to them. And they don't want to hear the unpleasant truth, and Varys says that nothing lasts. And I think this is most definitely a foreshadow of their relationship that they're experiencing right now will not last because Jon is a Targaryen, and it will throw a wrench in between their relationship and Daenerys' potential in gaining support for the throne. And this is great that Davos is saying this because he's fulfilling his purpose. Stannis was going to execute Davos for the treasons that he's committed, but Melisandre spared him. Like she said, Davos is needed. But she didn't realize that Davos wasn't needed for Stannis. Davos was needed for Jon.
You need someone to rebuild your army for you. Someone to convince this lord and that lord to fight for you. To bring sellswords and pirates to your side.
I've made my decision.
He's right. You need him. He has a part to play in the war to come.
Davos has been the voice for Jon. Davos has been the one to guard and support, and he's always been in Jon's corner. And we see him doing that in this scene, playing his role that the Lord of Light sees for him. And that role could be rallying members for the prince that was promised. But then we go to this scene between Daenerys and Jon. And Daenerys tells Jon that Sansa doesn't like her. And Daenerys says very strongly that it doesn't matter if Sansa doesn't like her because she is her queen. And Daenerys says, if she can't respect me, and then is interrupted. And I think this scene will more than definitely come back. Because what was Daenerys gonna say? If she can't respect you, then what? Lord Tarly and Dickon Tarly couldn't respect her either. So she burned them. And I keep saying that that's the key difference between their characters, and that's what Sam pointed out. Jon never fought for the throne, but Daenerys is. And because she is, she needs to rule with an iron fist. She needs to command respect. So I think that might come up because it might be insinuating that if she can't respect Daenerys, then she may lose her power, she may be executed, and I think that's a concern that Jon may bring up in future episodes. Especially since Sam had so much crap to talk about her. I think Sam put a lot of ideas in Jon's mind and worries. And that's the key issue of Daenerys right now and why a marriage makes sense. Because unlike Essos, she hasn't done anything to commend respect. The idea of people following her is purely based on Jon's acceptance of her and bending the knee to her. As far as everyone in Westeros is concerned, she is a foreign invader who is coming in killing their people, who don't follow her. And from the outside looking in, if you don't know Daenerys, she looks like a maniac, looking like she's entitled to a throne for a place she didn't even grow up in. So I think that's the key issue with Daenerys, is she's trying to gain the support and be a queen of a place that doesn't want her. And I can't see a circumstance in which they would want her. But then we see Jon and Daenerys go and visit the dragons because they're not eating. We see Rhaegal fascinated with Jon. And it's a nice scene between the two of them. We see Jon mount Rhaegal, and it's the first time that we see Jon ride a dragon. I personally wish they made this more badass. I would have liked to see this scene, but imagine the context of this scene and how much nicer it would be if in Season 7, Episode 6, instead of Benjen saving Jon, it was Rhaegal. Jon would close his eyes, just like Daenerys did in Season 5, and summoned his dragon, and Rhaegal would pick him up and rescue him. That would hint at his lineage, and it would paint a broader context for this scene. But that being said, I think there's a very high potential that we will see that moment with Jon, where he closes his eyes, and Rhaegal comes to rescue him, and that solidifies his place as a Targaryen. And while Jon rides the dragon, we see Varys, Tyrion, and Davos get a look at Jon on Rhaegal. And this has huge ramifications, and these characters aren't even thinking about it. Daenerys is basically in love, and she's giving Jon a lot because she respects him. But because of that, she's blind and she's crippling herself. Varys and Tyrion are in a proposal talk with Davos and really just kind of discounting it. But then she sees their queen giving everything to Jon. Daenerys is seen as feared, powerful, and a person to follow because of her dragons. And she gave all that power to Jon as soon as she let him ride her dragon. It's how she maintains her reputation, it's how she maintains her respect, it's everything that she is founded on as the mother of dragons. And she gave that to Jon Snow. So that feeds into Jon and Daenerys' relationship, because right now Jon bent the knee and Daenerys is his queen. But Daenerys is creating a dynamic where it's not based on a follower and a leader, it's based on equality. Jon is giving her counsel, she's letting Jon ride her dragon, so it makes it very hard to have rule or power over someone who is your equal. And now that Jon has found out that he's a Targaryen, it raises even more concerns, because Daenerys has lost all of her power to Jon already. The only power she has over Jon is the fact that Jon is saying that Daenerys is his queen. Other than that, she has nothing. And this could also hurt Jon too. The North hate Targaryens, and them seeing their king, or now their lord, ride a dragon, really would make them question if he really has their best interests in mind. And I think that's the key issue here, is that Daenerys and Jon are running around in love, but they're not thinking about the political implications and ramifications of their actions. And you have Tyrion, Varys, and Sansa dealing with it. But as we see Daenerys and Jon flying through the sky, we see Jon force Rhaegal to land, and this shows that he has control over the dragon. I believe before it was like Rhaegal was following Daenerys. Daenerys was in control. And Jon immediately turning Rhaegal means that he is now in control. It speaks to his bloodline, and it really speaks that Rhaegal may now be taking to Jon over Daenerys. And this could solidify Jon being an actual dragon rider. And I don't think this is the last time we're going to see Jon ride a dragon. But I think the next time we see Jon ride a dragon, It will be, like I said, very reminiscent of Season 5, and he will ride it because he has to. We then return to Gendry, and he makes an axe for the Hound made of dragon glass, and Arya appears and tells the Hound to leave Gendry alone. And Arya and the Hound have an interaction, and the Hound calls her very cold, and he leaves. But I think the Hound was expecting a better reunion. I think the Hound sees her as his daughter. He's like a father figure to her, and he cares a lot about her. And regardless of how Arya feels, I feel like she's burying her feelings about the Hound, and I think these characters will have a moment later in the season. But then Arya has a good scene with Gendry, and they discuss blacksmithing, and he calls her Lady Stark. That really harkens back to Season 3. But it seems like there's a potential romantic interest booming. Arya spent a lot of time becoming a faceless person, but now she's kind of come full circle, grown up, and has found herself again. And she did care a lot for Gendry, so maybe their relationship will evolve over the next couple episodes. But then we see that she has a job for Gendry, and she sends him plans for a weapon. And we see it's a handle with a piece of dragon glass that needs to be put into it. And this isn't a weapon that we've seen before, but I think Arya wants to prepare for the White Walkers, and she knows that needle won't cut it. So she needs a longer weapon that she can fight with, because right now she only has the dagger, and I'm sure she doesn't want to fight close quarters the whole time. I think potentially we could see her fighting with this in the trailer. It's a giant staff, and it makes sense because we've been seeing her learn how to fight with the stick when she was blind, learning from the Faceless Men. Or she could have also picked up a spear from a dead Unsullied. But we'll find out in episode 3. We then see a scene between Jon and Sansa, and we find out that Lord Glover is staying in his castle. And here they discuss those political ramifications that Jon isn't really thinking about. The fact that Jon abandoned his crown, Sansa insinuates that that's the reason why he's staying in his castle. And Jon defends himself, saying that he brought 2 armies and 2 dragons. And like I said before, Sansa's the only one who's really thinking politically, whereas Jon is only thinking about the threat to the north. And Jon asks Sansa if she has any faith in him at all. And seeming a little bit emotional, she says she does. And I believe her. Many people have faith in Jon. It's how he earned the trust of the Wildlings, became Lord Commander of the Night's Watch, and was chosen to be King of the North over Sansa. But the faith Sansa has in Jon isn't the problem, it's his decision making and how he's not thinking about his actions politically. He's only thinking about the dead. And she calls him out on bending the knee not to save the North, but because he loves Daenerys. And she was right. And it shows that she has the finger on the pulse of every single situation. Daenerys told Jon that she would fight for him, and she promised that. And after that, Jon bent the knee, showing that he didn't bend the knee out of strategy, he bent it out of emotion. He believed her as his queen, and he respected her. And the ramifications of Jon bending his knee will play out most definitely throughout the season. And we see that in between the scene of Jorah and Daenerys and Sam. And I love this scene. When Sam finds out that Daenerys murdered his father, Randall Tarly, and Dickon Tarly. And the reason why he's so emotional is because in Westeros, it's not common to burn High Lords, especially so rashly. That's why Tyrion and Varys had such a problem with it. Because she came with her big army from across the sea and burned Westeros people alive who didn't kneel. She didn't do anything to earn their trust or to gain their loyalty. She just came from across the sea, from a different land, with savages, and burned their homes and killed their people. And she claimed herself queen. And when they didn't support her, she killed them. Daenerys isn't in a position to get support. So of course Sam's brother and father didn't kneel. Because Daenerys doesn't understand Westeros. It's not Essos. She was so used to being queen in Meereen and the slave cities, she forgot what it is like to start from the bottom. She earned respect in Essos by freeing the slaves, the Unsullied, killing the Khal as Adash Khaleen. These acts earned her respect. And what she's done so far and what she's done to Sam's family is not earning her any respect. And it's the same reason why the North doesn't support her. Why would they support somebody who came from Essos? And how could somebody who was raised in that land possibly even understand the North or even have their best interests in mind? That's why they elected Jon. He was born in the North. He was raised in the North. He is a Northerner. And I think that's why the trial for Jaime is going to be so pivotal. Because what they're going to realize is who gives Daenerys the right to call for Jaime's head and potentially execute him like she did the Tarlys. Because the only thing that makes Daenerys queen right now is because she's claiming that she's queen. She has a big army and she has 2 dragons. But what happens when she loses some of her army and another dragon chooses Jon? I'm going to pretty much guarantee that Jaime will not kneel for Daenerys. It's not about loyalty, it's about survival. And I think that's the key difference between Daenerys and Jon. I'm not saying Daenerys is like the Mad King at all, but I'm saying she's trying to force power and earn respect from Westeros, and it's not working. Unlike Daenerys, Jon has built a strong foundation in Westeros, and Daenerys has not. And she feels like she earned respect, like when she was talking to the Tarlys, but she hasn't earned the respect yet. So then Sam storms outside and talks to Bran, who is still sitting in the same place because he's waiting for his old friend, and we know that this is Jaime. And Bran tells Sam that now it's time to tell Jon about his parents. And it's almost like it was the perfect time, because Sam is emotional and he believes in Jon. So we have an amazing scene between Jon and Sam, which I loved, finally seeing them come back together. But then Sam tells Jon. After every decision Jon has made, after sparing all those men that have followed him, he has always been king. And this just shows that Jon is more democratic as a leader. He was elected constantly, even though he was the rightful king. And Jon finds out that he's a Targaryen, and it's a lot to take in. He believes that it's treason, but it's the truth. And the only person who would say it's treason is Daenerys, because she's claiming herself as queen. And Sam says to Jon that he gave up his crown for his people. He asks if Daenerys would do the same, and I don't necessarily think that's true. Daenerys has already declared herself queen, and she went on the journey to become queen. That is her new reality. The only solution to pass this would be to marry Jon and Daenerys together like Davos was suggesting. But I don't know if Daenerys would be willing to give up power. And if that doesn't work, then Jon is a political threat to Daenerys. Even if Jon doesn't mean to be. Because there's people surrounding Jon with agendas, and that could affect the outcome on who sits on the Iron Throne. Because at the end of the day, you can burn as many people as you want and call yourself queen or king. But at the end of the day, like what Varys said, power resides where power resides. People put power where they believe it to be put. And right now, it seems like Jon holds the power in Westeros. For a couple of reasons. For one, he's the legitimate heir who grew up in Westeros. He's not a foreign invader. He was raised by the Honorable Ned Stark. And he has more of Westeros behind him. First of all, he has the North. He was raised in the North. He sees himself as a Stark. And he still is a Stark. He's Lyanna Stark's child. He has the Vale, because the Vale supports Sansa, and they're cousins to Robb and Arryn. He technically could have the Reach, because Cersei killed all of the Tyrells, and Daenerys killed all of the Tarlys. If there was going to be a head house to retake over the Reach, it could be the last Tarly, Sam. And he is in full support of Jon Snow. And then there's the Iron Islands. Yara supports Daenerys, whereas Theon, if he had the choice, would support Jon. And every other location is left deserted. The Stormlands have been dormant for years, but yet they have a Baratheon bastard who is really good friends with Davos and Jon. Casterly Rock is completely empty, with one Lannister supporting Dany, whereas another Lannister, Jaime, may support Jon. So I think this is going to have huge ramifications. And I think Jon will once again do the honorable and not the intelligent thing. Sansa will not approve, but he will tell Daenerys that he's Targaryen. And I think she could take this to her council. And Varys did promise her that he will never betray her, and he will tell her if she is failing the people. But I don't think that's going to happen. I think he could conspire with Sansa to work to put Jon on the throne. And right now we're in a position where Daenerys is giving her power to Jon. And Daenerys is trying to fight for power, and it's not working. The only thing that she has is her armies and her dragons. Jon has the North, and he has the Wildlings. Daenerys has the unsullied Dothraki and 2 dragons. In this episode, we saw Jon really take to one of those dragons. And we know that Harry Strickland and the Golden Company don't necessarily like supporting Cersei. Maybe Varys and Sansa could conspire to get the Golden Company and Harry Strickland to support Jon Snow. Much like how Jon gave the Wildlings lands to settle on in Westeros, maybe King Aegon Targaryen could once again bring the exiles of the Golden Company and give them lands to settle on in Westeros and pardon them for their previous actions. And that would be enough for the Golden Company to break their contract under the leadership of Aegon Targaryen, which is Jon Snow. But then we go to the final scene, and that is when Jaime arrives at Winterfell. And Bran is still there waiting for him. And this is the old friend that Bran was talking about. And I think that's because Bran doesn't see Jaime as the guy who pushed him out of the window anymore. He sees Jaime as the guy who made Bran who he was supposed to become. And I think with Jaime, we know he's going to go through the trial. And regardless of how it turns out, we'll know it'll be successful. If you want to see how I think it'll go, check out my episode 2 prediction video. But I think Jaime will have Brienne there, he will make friends there, and it could groom Jaime into the Valonqar. If Cersei gets out of hand and does anything rash, Jaime may be the Valonqar part of the prophecy to end her reign as queen. And maybe Jaime will die alongside her in King's Landing. And that might be the reason why Bran is taking such a fascination with Jaime. But that is what I think about this episode. I had a very long discussion on it, so please let me know what you guys think in the comments section down below. I'd love to hear your comments. But until next time, I'll see you guys later.